Hi folks, HR Funk here with number 47 in my series on law enforcement qualification course challenge videos. Now if you've not seen any of the other videos in this series up to this point, what I'm attempting to do is to fire a law enforcement firearms qualification course from each of the 50 states for the purpose of comparing and contrasting those courses and ultimately trying to determine what I think is the best law enforcement firearms qualification course in the country. Now this series does focus on duty handgun qualification courses, and I might do another series in the future on rifle and shotgun qualifications. And today's duty handgun qualification course comes to us from the state of Nevada. This Nevada course requires the officer undergoing qualification to fire 50 rounds, and those 50 rounds are divided into 13 different stages of fire. Those stages take place at distances as close as 3 yards from the target and as far away as 25 yards from the target. In order to achieve a passing score, the officer undergoing qualification has to score a 75%. And that score is determined by looking at where the shots strike the target. Now I have to point out at this point that this is not the actual target intended for use with this course, but it's very similar, especially in terms of its scoring area, and I think it's going to work just fine for demonstrating the course. Shots striking in the A or B zone, and for our purposes today, that's going to be everything inside of this light blue area here. So here, this lighter area and the white spot in the very center all achieve a score of 2 points for bullets striking there. Anything that strikes in the C zone, which is this lighter blue area out in this area, receives a score of 1.5 points, and anything striking in the D zone, which is the dark blue area at the very edge of the target, receives a score of 1 point. So when the officer is done firing his or her way through the course, the firearms instructor has to total up the value of the points in all those different areas on the target to determine if that officer did achieve the qualification standard of 75%. And it's time to meet today's challenger. Our challenger today for this Nevada course is the Generation 5 Glock 19 9mm service pistol. This is the pistol that many people believe is the finest handgun ever devised for law enforcement purposes. So I'm going to get it loaded up, and in just a minute, we're going to pit it against the Nevada course and see if it lives up to that reputation. And here we go. This Nevada course starts out at a distance of 3 yards from the target. And from that distance, the shooter begins with the firearm secured in the holster. On a signal to fire, the shooter has to draw and fire 2 rounds into the body of the target in a time limit of 3 seconds. That drill is repeated twice for a total of 6 rounds. Stage 2 takes place at a distance of 5 yards from the target. And from that distance, the shooter begins with the firearm in the non-dominant hand in a low ready position. On the signal to fire, the shooter has to fire 2 rounds into the body of the target in a time limit of 4 seconds. That drill is repeated 1 time for a total of 4 rounds on this stage. Stage 3 is fired at a distance of 7 yards from the target, and from that distance, the shooter again begins with the firearm in the holster. On the signal to fire, the shooter has to draw and fire 2 shots to the body and 1 shot to the head in a time limit of 5 seconds. That drill is then repeated for a total of 6 rounds on this stage. Stage 4 is also fired at a distance of 7 yards from the target. This time the shooter again begins with the firearm in the holster. On a signal to fire, the shooter has to draw and dominant hand only fire 2 rounds into the body of the target in a time limit of 5 seconds. That drill is repeated twice for a total of 6 rounds. For the next stage, I'm back to a distance of 10 yards from the target. And from that distance, the shooter begins with the firearm in the holster, and on a signal to fire, the shooter has to draw and fire 2 rounds into the body of the target in a time limit of 4 seconds. The shooter then goes to a low ready position, and on a second signal to fire, the shooter has to fire 2 more rounds into the body of the target in a time limit of 3 seconds. Now, I will have to stop the video between the first 2 shots and the second 2 shots just to reset my timer. And stage 6 is also fired at a distance of 10 yards from the target. This time the shooter begins with the firearm secured in the holster. On a signal to fire, the shooter has to draw and fire 2 rounds to the body of the target, then perform what the course description calls a speed reload, and then fire 2 more rounds into the body of the target in a time limit of 10 seconds. Stages 7, 8, and 9 all are fired from the 15-yard line. For stage 7, the shooter begins in a standing position, and on the signal to fire, the shooter has to assume a kneeling position and fire 2 rounds into the body of the target in a time limit of 7 seconds. Now, the course description does not indicate whether the shooter begins with the firearm in the holster or in a ready position. I'm going to assume it starts from the holster, and that's the way I'm going to perform the drill. That drill, by the way, is repeated 1 time for a total of 4 rounds on this stage. For stage 8, the shooter again begins at the 15-yard line with the firearm in the holster. On a signal to fire, the shooter has to draw and fire 2 rounds into the body from a standing position, then kneel down, perform a reload, and then fire 2 more rounds from the kneeling position, all in a time limit of 12 seconds. And for stage 9, again from 15 yards, the shooter begins with the firearm in the holster. On the signal to fire, the shooter has to draw and fire 2 rounds into the body of the target in a time limit of 5 seconds. Stages 10, 11, and 12 of this Nevada course are all fired from behind a position of cover at a distance of 25 yards. For stage number 10, the shooter begins with the firearm in the holster, and on the signal to fire, the shooter has to lean out from the left side of cover and fire 2 rounds into the body of the target in a time limit of 6 seconds. And stage 11 is exactly the same thing, only this time the shooter leans out from the right side of cover and fires 2 rounds into the body of the target in that time limit of 6 seconds. For stage number 12, the shooter begins standing behind the barricade, and on a signal to fire, the shooter drops to a kneeling position and from the left side of the barricade fires 2 rounds into the body of the target, then has to move behind cover, reload, and then from a kneeling position on the right-hand side of cover, fire 2 more rounds into the body of the target in a time limit of 12 seconds. Thirteenth and final stage of this Nevada course, folks, and this one also takes place at a distance of 25 yards from the target. Here again, the shooter begins standing with the pistol holstered. On the signal to fire, the shooter has to drop into a prone position and fire 2 rounds from the prone position into the body of the target in a time limit of 10 seconds. And that's going to do it for this Nevada course, folks. By the way, I should have mentioned at the beginning of the video, this is not a statewide mandatory course in Nevada. Rather, it's a course used by one of the large agencies in that state. In terms of how I ended up, I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 shots in the C zone. So I have to deduct a half a point for each one of those. So there's 3.5 points. I have 1 shot in the D zone. I have to deduct 1 full point for that. So there's 4.5. And I have 1 shot, one of my headshots that was a miss. I have to deduct 2 full points for that. So when you do the math on that, I ended up with a 93.5. So not too bad for my first time ever shooting through this course. If you recall, at the beginning of the video, the qualification standard on this course is 75 points. And this is a fairly challenging course. And I'm going to go down through and discuss this a little bit here in a moment and talk about what I think of the course itself. So in terms of this course itself, as I said, this is a pretty challenging course. There's a lot of things going on in here. We have shooting all the way from 3 yards back to 25 yards, stopping off at 5 yards, 7 yards, 10 yards, and 15 yards. And fully 20% of this course, or 20% of the shots fired for this qualification, take place from the 25-yard line. So that's significant. So definitely there's an emphasis on longer range shooting. Also, the time limits are tight enough that they make you work. There's not a lot of time to get the absolute perfect sight picture and squeeze off the best shot you can, which is why I had some of my shots wander a little ways outside the area where I would like for them to have been. Also, we've got dominant and non-dominant hand only shooting. We have shooting from behind cover. So lots of good things going on here. And again, very challenging time limits. Now, we didn't see a couple of the more advanced drills in this, like shooting while moving or forced transition drills or anything like that. Even so, I think when I plug this course into my evaluation matrix, it's going to score pretty well. And here's one last look at today's challenger. The Generation 5 Glock 19 shot very well through this course. Now, some of you know I'm not the biggest fan of Glock pistols, but I certainly can't complain about the reliability of this pistol. I do think it was handicapped a little bit at the longer range stages because of the shorter sight radius, and also these are not exactly target sights, so I was not able to get the finest sight picture, and I mentioned that a few minutes ago. Even so, the shooting, any shots outside of where I wanted them are on me. They are not on the pistol, so I take the blame for that, and I just have to work more with this pistol if I want to shoot it better. And that's the video. Course number 47 is in the can. I've got 3 more to go, and then I'll finally be able to choose what I think is the best law enforcement handgun qualification course in the country. If you have any questions or comments on this video, as always, make sure you forward those to me. Remember, if you order anything from Optics Planet, be sure to use my discount code, which is... And if you use that discount code, it's good for 5% off anything you purchase from Optics Planet. See you next time, folks. And until then, good shooting. Bye-bye.